Well, hello to all of my methodical researchers out there. This is the first video of Module 7, which discusses additional sources and additional strategies for researching that codified law. However, we are actually going to talk about a few secondary sources that have some really important similarities to codified law. And these sources are the Restatement, model laws, and uniform laws. So, first things first, let me emphasize that point again. These are secondary sources. So although they may have some structural similarities to that codified law, they are only ever going to be persuasive authority. Don't mistake model laws, uniform laws, or even the restatement for the actual law. They are not primary sources. These are all secondary sources. Now, these sources are useful to discuss together because of the similarity to the codified law, and because when you use any one of them for your research, you will be taking the same basic approach. So, first, you'll find out that for whatever issue that you're researching, your jurisdiction has adopted the restatement or the uniform or model law. And then once you've ascertained that, you will locate the specific part of the restatement or the section of the annotated uniform law or the part of the annotated model law. And when you locate that, it's also important that you note which revision your jurisdiction has adopted, because some of these are actually updated quite frequently. Then after you've located that, you're going to either, number one, use the editorial commentary of the restatement or the annotated model or uniform law to make an argument about how it was meant to be interpreted. Or number two, you're going to use the restatement or the annotated model or uniform law as a tool to find other jurisdictions who have adopted that same law and argue that their interpretation should apply to the law as it was adopted by your jurisdiction. And the basic idea here is that these arguments are going to be especially persuasive because even though you were relying upon the commentary that is technically in a secondary source or relying upon the persuasive authority from a foreign jurisdiction that you use that source to find, these sources are still discussing the same law promulgated by the same source and adopted for the same reasons. Now, this of course means that these sources are only going to be useful for you if your jurisdiction has indeed adopted the model law or the uniform law or the restatement. Now, although these three sources are used in similar ways, they are obviously quite different as sources. So what are their different characteristics? Well, basically, as far as model laws go, they're different because basically anyone can propose, whatever model law that they think represents the best approach to a particular topic, issue, or area. And that means that really model laws are just proposed by a very wide range of different organizations with different views who are proposing these model laws for very different purposes and reasons. Your most famous examples of model laws really differ quite a bit. You've got the model rules of professional conduct, which are promulgated by the American Bar Association. And then you've got the Model Penal Code, which is actually the product of the American Law Institute, which is somewhat confusingly also the same organization that drafts the restatement. And model laws generally aren't going to be something that a jurisdiction adopts in full. And they also usually aren't going to include quite as much in the way of commentary and annotations as the other two sources. They're not quite as scholarly, it's not quite as in-depth. Now, on the other hand, uniform laws. Uniform laws are drafted by an organization called the Uniform Law Commission. It's a really well-respected body of attorneys and subject matter experts, and they're really largely a neutral organization, and most of these uniform laws are really intended to address topics or areas where it is just considered to be especially important that the law is uniform. This definitely applies to the most important uniform law, the Uniform Commercial Code, or the UCC, which governs the sale of goods and some other commercial transactions, and it has been adopted by all 50 states. You'll probably study it in contracts. I found it to be one of the more challenging topics in law school, but your mileage may vary on that. However, there are also a lot of other important, very widely adopted uniform laws, such as the Uniform Child Custody Jurisdiction Act and the Uniform Partnership Act, which cover topics that should be apparent just from their titles. Uniform laws are generally going to contain many helpful annotations, a lot of substantial commentary from the commission to help you understand the law. Now, the restatement is really a little bit different from these other two sources, a little bit different from the model laws or the uniform laws. It is drafted by the American Law Institute, or the ALI, which is a body of really well-respected legal scholars, and the idea behind the restatement is essentially to summarize and codify the common law. This means that in the restatement, we get a lot of scholarly commentary about the development of the law and about the competing approaches that various jurisdictions might take to an issue. And in doing this, the restatement will always give you its recommended approach, and that's where it really resembles model laws and uniform laws. And sometimes these approaches essentially codify the majority common law approach, but at other times they give that approach a major overhaul. They really change the law while they're restating it. A good example of that is in the area of products liability, where the restatement approach was really a major departure from the common law approach to products liability at the time, but in the end it proved to be very influential, so that most jurisdictions have actually adopted that approach by now, but it was really out ahead of the law in that area. Now, as I alluded to earlier, there are really two major ways that you're going to use all three of these sources. The first way is that you're going to use the editorial commentary that's provided by the drafters. These are going to be included in the source as footnotes or comments of some kind, and they'll give you a really good idea of how the drafters intended for their version of the law to be interpreted. Now, the second way that you'll use these sources involves using them to find primary authority in the form of cases from other quote-unquote foreign jurisdictions that have adopted the uniform or model law or the restatement for your specific legal topic or issue. Now, all of these sources that we've looked at, the restatement, the model laws, the uniform laws, they're all going to contain annotations that will describe to you which jurisdictions have adopted what and delineate all of their varying interpretations. This can quickly get pretty complicated because as these sources get updated, different jurisdictions will adopt different versions. And of course, different jurisdictions might also adopt a particular uniform or model law less completely than other jurisdictions, or even arrive at differing interpretations of the same uniform or model law. Now, the better sources, such as the restatement or uniform laws annotated, the better sources will do a really good job of documenting all of this, all of these different approaches and incomplete adoptions, and they'll also direct you towards the most important cases in these different jurisdictions. Now, for your less thorough sources, like some of your model laws, you may end up having to put some of the work in yourself to find all of these differing interpretations, but the source itself will still provide you with a good start. But the basic idea is that you would use these annotations to find other jurisdictions who have adopted the same model or uniform law or statement and have interpreted it in a similar way. You would then use these cases as persuasive authority, which, if you think about it, it does make sense since the laws are both derived from the same essential source. Now, these sources can all either be found on Westlaw or Lexis, although Westlaw's source, Uniform Laws Annotated, is really the most comprehensive source for uniform laws. So if you have access to that, it really is preferable that you go to that and use it for uniform laws. Okay, everybody, what time is it? It's everyone's favorite time. It's example time. First, let's take a look at a uniform law. So let's say you're doing some research on the issue of jurisdiction for the purposes of child custody. This is a pretty complicated topic. You are specifically looking at which court has the initial jurisdiction to make a child custody determination, specifically in a situation where the court has that jurisdiction due to a significant connection with the dispute or with the child. And in doing that research, you've pulled up this statutory section in the Georgia Code on the initial child custody jurisdiction. So one reason that you're always going to want to look at your trusty table of contents for codified law is pretty simple. You're going to want to know the name of the statute that you're working with. And here, this is particularly important because we can see, just looking at our table of contents, that Georgia has adopted this uniform law, the Uniform Child Custody and Jurisdiction Enforcement Act. And this section is just a part of that act. So yes, this is a source that we definitely want to take a look at in our research. We're going to want to look at the annotated version of that uniform law. Now, we might do that earlier in our research for additional analysis to sort of add on and fill in the gaps of our preliminary analysis using that editorial commentary. And we also might use it a little later in our research when we're nearing the end of that case law step so that we can use its annotations to find that valuable persuasive authority once we've already located the mandatory authority. We've already sort of exhausted that and we're looking for stuff that's merely persuasive. So let's take a look at it. In Westlaw, the source that we want is called Uniform Laws Annotated. It can be somewhat tricky to find because even though it is indeed a secondary source, as I so emphasized earlier, you are going to find it under statutes. So you'll go to Statutes and Court Rules. And then this sidebar of Tools and Resources, it's going to be located under here, Uniform Laws Annotated. So once we're actually at the source, finding it is relatively easy. It's organized under all of these topical headings. We would just scroll down to the one with uniform laws related to family law. Here we go. And then we just browse until we see it. Here it is. Child Custody Jurisdiction and Enforcement Act. So the first thing that we see in the table of contents for the Uniform Child Custody Jurisdiction and Enforcement Act are these general references and annotations that apply to the entire uniform law. And the first thing that we run into in this general section is a pretty useful table that tells us which jurisdictions have adopted this law and where it is located in their respective statutory codes and when they adopted it. And we can see, if we just scroll down, that it really looks like pretty much every jurisdiction has adopted this one, which makes sense. You would definitely want the law to be uniform in this particular area because there's such a strong interest in avoiding conflicting decisions from different courts on who has custody of a child. That would be really bad. And we can get more details on those adoptions if we navigate to the History tab here. And this is something that you're going to want to make a habit of doing when you use uniform laws annotated because many jurisdictions have made changes or added sections when they adopted the uniform law, which really makes it not that uniform ultimately. And these are all things that could potentially affect the way that you would use this source or the way that you would make arguments, because they would affect like the substance of the law in that jurisdiction. So you really need to know about the changes that jurisdictions have made before you delve much further into the source. So if you scroll down here, you can see that it does indeed look like Georgia has made a few changes. Specifically, it's added a few sections to this uniform law. So we would want to carefully look at what it has added to see what changes those have made and what ways it has departed from the uniform law in this area. And this section also would usually give us a history of the uniform law itself. With this particular uniform law, we can see that it does have a predecessor, the Uniform Child Custody Jurisdiction Act of 1968. But aside from its enactment to supersede that predecessor uniform law, it doesn't look like it's actually been updated that much. It hasn't really been revised at all, in fact, which makes the history of this uniform law a little less complicated than some of the other ones that you might see. If a uniform law has been revised multiple times, you really need to carefully consult this history tab to see which of those revisions is the actual one that your jurisdiction has adopted. Now, if we scroll down and just look at the rest of sort of this general prefatory note, it is going to just give us some kind of general editorial commentary on the uniform law as a whole. At the end, it also refers us to some scholarly commentary. You can see that here, several law reviews, and these could potentially be pretty helpful secondary sources to us. So we might want to note some of these in our research. So after checking out that general section at the very beginning, we can use the table of contents to navigate to the specific section that we were looking at before. We know it involves jurisdiction, and here it is, initial child custody jurisdiction. And once we've done that, we can see that after the actual text of the section, we get some more editorial commentary specifically about this section. It describes the purpose of the section, how its different aspects are meant to work together, and this could really be useful in sort of filling in some of the blanks in your preliminary analysis and getting a more complete picture of the law. And in some situations, when you can't find any other primary sources, you might also consider using this commentary as persuasive authority as well. However, it would always be better if a cite to this was coupled with cites to some type of mandatory authority if it were available. And we can also see that the second comment is on the significant connection issue specifically. So that's probably the one that we would want to focus on, since that seemed to be the main issue we were researching. So yeah, that is our first use of a uniform law, to find and use this editorial commentary by the drafters for either additional understanding and analysis or as persuasive authority about the intent and purpose of the law in certain situations. Now, for our second use of a uniform law, finding cases from foreign jurisdictions to use as persuasive authority, we would go to the Notes of Decision tab. In that respect, it is very similar to statutory annotations. It's one of the reasons we study them together. The editors of the uniform law have collected what they feel to be the most important decisions from all of the jurisdictions that have adopted the law, and they have organized them topically under these different headings. And we're interested in jurisdiction based on that significant connection. I don't see that in the headings here. So normally what I would probably do is just run Control F search. And here we go. We've got a Nebraska case that involves that issue. And, if we were researching that particular issue and we just couldn't locate a Georgia case, it didn't seem like maybe there was a Georgia case on that particular topic, this might be really helpful to us. This might be a case that we would want to use as persuasive authority, since we know that this underlying law is going to be largely the same. But before you would do that, you would want to go back and look at that history tab and see how Nebraska's adoption of this section might have varied from the text of the uniform law. This is very similar to what we looked at under that sort of those general annotations just a minute ago, except these were going to be only variations in the way that different jurisdictions have adopted this particular section. And we can scroll down. And yes, it actually does appear that Nebraska has made some changes. And before we use the Nebraska case as persuasive authority, we would need to make sure that this particular change doesn't affect the meaning of the law for our purposes. Okay, so let's take a quick look at the restatement. So let's say that we're doing some research into Georgia's product liability law. We're specifically looking at the manufacturer's duty to warn and who they must warn. And to do that research, we're reading a really handy treatise here, Georgia Products Liability Law on Westlaw. And while we're doing that, we find this footnote here that describes Georgia's early adoption of this section of the Restatement Second of Torts. And it also conveniently gives us a link to the actual section that was adopted. So I'm going to pull a little open link in new tab magic to get to that section. And when we do that, the first thing that we get here is going to be the actual text of the restatement. This is the way that they have organized their preferred approach to this issue in the law. Then after we scroll by that, we get this commentary. And this commentary is pretty expansive, and it really is the most important part of the restatement, and it's what you're the most likely to use, both as a guide to understanding the law in that area and on that particular topic, and as a persuasive authority. And really, if your court has adopted the restatement in that area, it can carry a lot of weight, just this editorial commentary. And it basically proceeds section by section, and that does mean that you may need to do some analytical work just to figure out, what here in this very substantial commentary is actually relevant for your specific issue. And the commentary also includes some really helpful illustrations that give us sort of hypothetical fact patterns and discuss how the law would apply, how their preferred version of the law would apply to those fact patterns. And that can be really helpful if your particular factual scenario, resembles one of those. And so after that, after we scroll through the commentary, we get case citations by jurisdiction, and they're all from jurisdictions that have adopted this section of the restatement, and each one is just going to give us a short description of the case that adopted it. And this can be really helpful when we're trying to locate persuasive authority. These different cases that have adopted the approach of the restatement in different jurisdictions. And overall, I think you can probably see that it's really pretty similar in many ways to the uniform laws. Really, the key difference here is that a court and not a legislature would adopt the restatement, since it's largely just going to be a codification or restatement of the law on different common law topics. So yeah, that's uniform and model laws along with the restatement. And if these apply to your situation, you're definitely going to want to locate them. The commentary can be just very useful as an aid to understanding the law that you're dealing with. And in some situations, you might even use it as a persuasive authority. And these sources are also very helpful just as tools for finding foreign case law that you can then turn and use as persuasive authority. Okay, that's all I have for now. Until next time.